Welcome to Saltgrass, a show about how local communities can engage with the climate crisis at a grassroots level. My name is Ali Hanley. So this episode follows on from our last episode with Rob Law. And you might remember that we talked about how large groups of councils across the state of Victoria are starting to work together to bring in 100% renewable energy for their operations, and they're installing electric vehicle charging stations in small towns right across, which is great for the electric vehicle transition that we all need to make. So the group of councils that my shire is part of also includes the city of Mildura, which is over 400 kilometres to the north of us. My interest in Mildura has been growing lately. It's a regional city that sits right on the mighty Murray River. The Murray is Australia's longest river, famous for paddle steamers, and it's part of the Murray-Darling River Basin system, which reaches from Queensland to South Australia, and much of Victoria and New South Wales is part of this river basin as well. Another thing to know is that the region is referred to as the Mallee. This word is thought to originate from the word Mallee, meaning water, in the Wemba Wemba language, an Aboriginal language of southern New South Wales and Victoria, and has subsequently been used to describe many types of plants that grow across this region. In its natural state, this region is a floodplain. It is very flat and very dry when not in flood. It is technically semi-arid, and it has sand dunes and huge dust storms. The Murray River is one of the only sources of water for this region, and the soil is naturally very sandy and salty. And despite being so far inland, it is very low-lying and in the past has been connected to the ocean. Colonisation and the engineering structures of barricades, locks and weirs along the length of the Murray River has recently controlled the river's flow and prevented the wide-scale flooding events that the environment is adapted to have. Add on top of that the large amounts of water drained from the river each year for agricultural purposes, and you have a very complicated region to manage, both socially and environmentally. And I've been up to Mildura twice this year, and I've collected interviews each time I went. So why Mildura? According to climate projections, as climate change progresses, my region and my town may have a climate much more like Mildura's in the coming decades. So that's 400 kilometres closer to the equator, and Castlemaine will soon be like that. And that's with moderate climate change, not extreme. And I'd also heard about the huge solar farms going in up there, and that was enough to pique my curiosity about this city so far away from us. So country towns and cities do have a reputation of being more conservative and a little resistant to change. Castlemaine is a bit of an anomaly in terms of how active and progressive many of its residents are. So I was curious to see how climate action is going in a place like Mildura. So my first visit this year was with a friend, and we headed up in March, which is at the tail end of a long, hot summer. So everything in central Victoria is dry and yellow, and the cool weather and rains have not usually arrived in March to take the edge off the heat or the dusty, dry, bushfire-prone kind of weather. We're all tired of the colours yellow and brown by then, and we're longing for a bit of rain. And what really surprised me when we reached Mildura was how green so many of their lawns are. The interview I'm going to share with you today was taken back in March with Mildura's Mayor, Jason Modica, and their Councillor for Environment and Sustainability, Jodi Reynolds. We talk about the environment and social issues. Specifically, we talk about water and the solar boom that's happening up there. And then in the next few weeks, I will have more episodes from the Mildura region to share with you. As regular listeners will know, I always acknowledge country at the start of the show. This time I would like to acknowledge both the Dja Wurrung, whose land I live on and where this episode has been edited and released from, and also the First Nations people of the Mallee. So that's up in Mildura, where these interviews were recorded and the country that we're discussing in these episodes. So the people and language groups in that area include the Barkenji, the Lachi Lachi, the Wurgai and the Karenji. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change.
Saltgrass. Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. I'm interested in the fact that the Mildura City Council has recently declared a climate emergency. How recent was that?
That was on the 26th of February last year where we called for that. It was very much driven by current Deputy Mayor Helen Healy. But I think there's always been quite an interesting pedigree of looking at the environment in the region, but it just took a little while for it to get there because of probably the more of the conservative attitudes in parts of rural Australia.
I think that's changing, actually. I think that we're finding that there's a lot more people that are keen to see those kinds of issues moved forward and keen to make sure that we're part of that bigger movement that's happening over the world.
Yeah, I feel like the declaration of climate emergency is something that's only just started to happen, and councils one by one are picking them up. And in Australia especially, I really feel like because of our federal government's attitudes to climate change, there's more and more action happening at local levels as citizens, but also local councils are going, okay, well, we're not going to get help from above. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I think this, Miriam Wilkinson's The Carbon Club. I haven't read it, but it talks about the Australian Mr. Hill, the Environment Minister going to Kyoto in '97 and basically moving away from embracing renewables for Australia and getting in lockstep with the old methods of generating energy. So it's quite long, and I think we've worked really hard as a council, the previous one and even the one before to some extent, to really try and work out how great it is for this region. We've got the longest amount of sunshine. There's no mountains on either side. I did a little bit of work in the federal election and run into people from Europe who were doing developments down south, and they're saying, why aren't you going at 1,000,000 miles an hour? So it's really changing because it just makes sense, particularly on the dollar level.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I notice up here one of the differences between up here in Mildura and down in central Victoria and Mount Alexander Shire is that it feels up here like the council's really leading on climate change, whereas in Castlemaine and surrounds there's a great groundswell of community action that is then forcing the council to take action, which I find that really interesting, that difference.
Well, I think actually that the community here is really active, and I think you see that in how they voted this round. So the community's actually voted a progressive council in, one that they know that's going to drive those issues forward. They've been active on the ground for a long time, and I think that that's reflected in exactly how progressive we have been. We're actually punching above our weight here. We were the 30th local government in Victoria to declare a climate emergency. So that's actually pretty good for a council coming from a fairly conservative background. It does come from the people. They might not necessarily be the most vocal and the most visual groups, but they are definitely having an impact here.
Just to comment on that too, the horticultural and agriculture, whenever a farmer can save a few bucks, because it's such a difficult business to be in with the the bull and bear markets of whatever you're growing, they really have taken to it as well. And there's a couple of other things that I find really interesting. My wife and I participated in the second group buy scheme in 2010 in Mildura, which 300 people got together, collaborated and bought 300 units of solar panels and put them on our house at 66 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're only like 2 kilowatt units, but also $6 billion worth of investment over the last 8 or 9 years of large scale industrial solar from sort of Red Cliffs to Oyen. I think Mars have just bought into Kiamal and a fully solar. So there's two things going on. We do have, I'll use the word again, a great pedigree in people putting solar on their roofs, but also big money comes here to try and offset their footprint or try and buy renewable energy. As Roscano says, in the middle of the day in Mildura, you're just going to have the cheapest energy in the world in the next 3 to 5 years. It'll be huge.
It's amazing. Yeah, so I was really interested to come up here because I know about these big solar farms going up, and I wasn't aware of how much household solar and rooftop solar was going in, but it sounds like there's been some really great initiatives to get people to get rooftop solar on. Can you talk a bit more about the rooftop solar and the household? Yeah,
well, there was the 2 group buy schemes, and then they were very well patronised, so everybody got on early. Some people doubled up and ended up with 4 kilowatts at 66 cents an hour, and they're still making money out of it, which I don't know whether that's the best way to do it, but that's the way it happened back then. And then I have lots of friends. I'm a tradesman, I'm a tiler by trade, so I know a lot of Sparkies who have moved their business across to solar because they'll come and do an audit and they'll say, well, if you reglaze your windows and if you change your washing machine or your fridge and then you get a 7.8 kilowatt system and you only run stuff during the day, it's just going to pay for itself really, really quickly.
And look, Council's been really proactive with making sure that all the council infrastructure is equally as solar friendly and environmentally friendly as well.
I think we've got about 600 kilowatts on all our buildings, so it saves quite a lot a year, quite a lot of money. And that came in early too. So that was there when I got onto council in 16.
Absolutely. But the limitation that we have, though, is the Kerrang interchange. So we've got, all this fantastic renewable energy possibility here, but it's limited by how much we can pump out. And we could be exporting the energy is what we're limited by, but I believe that the Kerrang interchange is high on both state and federal agendas to get that sorted out and get that done. Once we can get that done, this area will be one of the, a solar power energy for Australia. We can be exporting this to New South Wales and to other parts of Victoria.
What are some of the objections people have had to large-scale solar farms, and what's the reality of them?
Well, there hasn't really been any objections because they are on broad acreage farms off the road and you can hardly see them. So an average wheat farm here might be 7,000 acres. So the old infrastructure that went through their land that they sort of had to drive their tractors around when they sowed or harvested, Caradoc is 700 and Kiamal is 1 million panels. So there's really been no pushback. There was a drive to put 22,000 panels in 3 different spots in an old rural residential area. That created huge kickback and the council voted against it because we believe, like any sort of planning, orderly planning should be where it least affects people, where it can give some good returns for the farmers because it actually levels out those bad years if you can rent your land to a large multinational. I remember talking to the finance guy from Germany at Caradoc and he said, "Oh, Jace, it just makes sense on paper. Why wouldn't you do it?"
Yeah.
So one of the big concerns that's been raised over and over again in our municipality, because there are so many, is what will we do with those panels when their end of life comes along? And we've been assured that, all the glass and all the aluminium can be reused or recycled, and they're working in Europe on trying to be able to recycle the actual silicon, the electronics and the silicon-based print in under the glass.
I think what they're finding is that the solar panels actually have a much longer life than they ever anticipated they would have. I mean, the panel itself does start to reduce the amount of electricity that it puts out over time, but the solar panels that were put in 30 years ago are still producing energy. So there is not a great, stockpile of used solar panels anywhere waiting to be recycled yet, and the technology is catching up. So that's good news, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And it's good to hear that they can be recycled at the end of their life to at least a degree. You mentioned that the farmers get some effectively rent for having the solar panels on there. And that is really good because we hear so many stories of farmers, especially as climate change comes in and Australia gets drier and it's harder to produce. So that sounds like a really good win-win for the farmers as well. And they still have enough land to actually do their business and farm.
Totally. Well, and then once again, it becomes a business decision for them. They map out what they're going to lose. They calculate, X amount of return a year for lease for the land, X amount on a, average out your years as a grain grower, and then make the decision. But not many of them get the choice because the footprint of where the power lines go, they're only ever going to go that way. It's if it's upgraded, like Roscano says, if you could put large distribution wires connecting the capitals or even overseas, that's when you can get your secondary level kick of just generating massive amounts of power during the day. It flips the old model on its head completely.
Yeah. So if you're listening from overseas, I don't know where Latrobe Valley is. It's southeast corner of Victoria. And so it's a massive coal-fired power station. And so the electricity is running from that southeastern point north and west and across the rest of Australia. And so the infrastructure itself can't flow the other way. Is that what you're saying?
Can, but just not on the volume. And because it is intermittent, everything needs to be upgraded a little bit to be able to deal with it, with that intermittency and how the power comes in.
Yeah, and because it's centralised from that point, the power is set up to deliver electricity to everywhere from that centralised point, whereas what just Jason is saying about tipping the old system on its head, the system is now going to be decentralised. It's going to be a network of smaller, more nimble power supply areas.
And so you see massive wind farms down on the coast in Western Victoria, and you see massive solar farms up here in the north where you get the most sun. And yeah, we're looking at biodigesters and other sort of circular economy models of generating power locally in central Victoria. It also means that, then it is spread out. So if any one of any one site fails for any reason, you've still got power to the majority of the state.
So it's almost a version of a microgrid everywhere, and there's even a great wind north of Horsham too. So there's levels of where you go, and that sort of matches in with our solar credentials and their wind credentials.
And you add batteries into that equation, and I think one of the things that people worry about when they think about renewable energy is, what are we going to be doing at night time? The sun doesn't shine at night. Yeah. Well, batteries are there for exactly that purpose. So they are coming on so quickly. The price is coming down. They're becoming more available to the everyday person in their homes, the same way that solar panels are. So once again, with government support and with community driving that demand for that technology, it'll be in everybody's homes soon.
I always started talking about energy sovereignty. So it's not just about the change to renewables, whether it's green hydrogen, solar or wind. It's about retrofitting every house. So if every house is a net producer of energy and consumes as little as it can, you're actually changing the whole dynamic of how we look at energy and how you would build a house in the first place. So, me, it's a tiered understanding of how we consume, why we consume, and who controls the way we might think about consumption. And I think that flicks back to the federal government's long commitment and support of renewables. I don't have a problem with that in the past, because that's what it was. It's clearly changed in batteries. As Jodi said, Hornsdale in South Australia has been a phenomenon that Mr. Tesla put in. I'd love to hang out with him
Elon
for the
Musk.
afternoon.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Musk. So, but also Ganawara has put in a massive battery too, which is on the Kerrang link. So there's already those little pulses or little tendrils of green. Is that too much of a pun?
No, I like it. I like
little
it.
tendrils of green that show, but it has, to me, and I'm being really parochial about this, it has to be bound to how we live. You want a beautiful house, you want an open, it doesn't have to be big or large, but it needs to be that energy sovereignty and giving you choice and not being dictated to by who may or may not control the infrastructure.
I think that's a really good point. And with climate change, there's this idea that, it's going to get hotter and drier, and we're all going to want to use air conditioning more. But if the air conditioning is running off coal, then we're making climate change worse. So this idea of everyone having their own little power plant on their roof and being backed up by these bigger projects that are scattered across the state and across the country really makes sense.
I actually do experiments on my own house. We've got solar air modules. Have you ever heard of them? They're little 1 metre squares that are 80 mil thick, and they have a black base, and they have one solar panel, so not connected to your electricity at all. So in Mildura, between May and August, when you get a 19 or 20 degree day, it'll pump. We've got 5 of them on the roof, and it's got a little fan. It'll pump 23 degree heat into the house all day, which stops us using the wood. And then they also have a solar whiz, which if you keep the cavity between the inside ceiling and your tiles or your timber or your steel, if you keep that at a constant level, the whiz sucks out all the cold or hot air in your roof, which insulates your house on another level as well. So there's a whole level of technology, old school technology out there, that actually gives you the opportunity to make your footprint a bit smaller, and it costs less in the long run.
Yeah, so what Jason's talking about there is a passive energy, so you're actually using the energy of the earth or the environment or of the air to passively regulate your home. But another way of doing that is by making sure that your cities are green and having canopy and having enough trees to make sure that your homes are shaded, for example, and your streets are shaded, and that you're creating an environment that you don't necessarily need to heat or cool too much. I think that the Mildura Council is leading in that area as well. So we've got a green and tree canopy policy and plan that we're working on at the moment. And I think that was going to make a big difference for Mildura too. In 2018, we were involved with the Cool It project with 7 other local government councils in the region. With small towns in the region, we're particularly exposed to increasing daytime heat. I mean, Mildura is one of them, and with climate change approaching us, that is not going to change. So it's basically about increasing the canopy in streets and parks and gardens. I think we're as low as 7% in some towns. 7% coverage.
Oh, okay, so there's
canopy.
Not a huge amount of trees giving shade.
Correct. So what I've seen in other towns, and I think Sydney's doing this now, they've embarked on a huge project. 25% coverage is what they're aiming for. They're going to do it over 5 years, and they're spending, $1.5 million to do it. So we are in the process of seeing what that looks like for Mildura and making sure that we get some the similar sort of coverage here, what that might look like, and how we're going to work towards that over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Driving into this town, I was so surprised to see green lawns everywhere. And I was like, wow, how are they doing that? It's because one of the things I really thought was interesting about the Castlemaine and Mildura as sort of parallel cities is that as climate change comes in, we're going to expect our climate to become more like yours is now. And to have green lawns already, I mean, we don't have the massive Murray running through our town. We don't have that luck. But we're already on water restrictions most of the year, through summer especially. And to see all of these beautiful green lawns was quite surprising. But then I realised people are probably using the river water. And this is a topic we'll get into in a minute, is water usage in this region. But in terms of planting big trees that can then provide substantial shade, it allows the smaller plants and the ground cover to survive these brutal burning summers. We've got a few projects in central Victoria that are looking at greening as well. And so it creates sort of microclimates, doesn't it?
Definitely, absolutely. So it's going to be absolutely essential going forward. I think that agriculture is going to have to be thinking about this, and I think they are. Grape growers are aware that the climate is going to be changing, and they're also making changes and calculations about how they're going to deal with that too. So we talk about our homes and ourselves and us as humans and having comfortable lives, but we've also got to think about the sustainability of Mildura as a township and as a region, and agriculture has got a lot to do with that.
Look, I think it brought acreage back to that as well. There's always been discussion, and I know the CMA do a lot of work with people who are interested, and subsidies too, to plant up their boundaries with 4 metres of natives for two reasons: to stop that if you get the western wind coming in and it's been dry, we can get huge, horrible dust storms here. But if you plant up all your fence lines with natives, it sort of slows that down and gives a place where native animals can move to. So that's something that we've discussed. It hasn't come to fruition yet. But across the board with that, I think someone said the other day, on average, we used to have 6 days over 40. It's projected that it might be 18 or 19 in the next little while per year. Yeah. So fresh fruit growers have their overhead sprinklers or their underhead sprinklers, but they have little misters on the top of some of the strainer posts as well, because if it gets over 40, they just turn them on, which drops, because they're already adapting to how hot it is and how, growing fresh fruit or fresh grapes is a very viable industry. So they can do that to make sure that they can protect their crops. So it's already happening in a way.
Yeah, people are already adapting.
Absolutely.
And I guess that idea of creating natives on the boundaries is a windbreak, but it also creates wildlife corridors and a bit of biodiversity and all of that stuff, which is really important too.
Could I just say, point 3 of the climate emergency I thought was interesting. I just wanted to bring up, because we're going to have a climate emergency community reference group. So there's that second level. We're always going back to our community to make sure what we've chosen through what we've heard is redirected back to the public. So the community consultation developed community-owned and activated climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So that's really important for us as a council to make sure that we continue to have the discussion, and bring the best science to the table and then be directed by what our community want.
That's so great.
I think the difficult thing here, for particularly in the Mildura from Mildura through to the South Australian border, is you can do everything right. You can use no-till, you can use organic, you can do whatever you want. But if you have, I think our average rainfall is 250 mil a year, give or take. And I think in 17-18 or 18-19, I can't remember which 2 years, it was 87 mil and 110. So that's the sort of pressure that is applied. So you can do everything you need to with the best of intentions, but if that climate continues to change, our adaptability will have to match that to some level, or it stops. So. And
I imagine people's reliance on the river then becomes so important. So the Murray River is ginormous, beautiful river running through. It's part of the Murray-Darling Basin. I did an episode last year with some filmmakers who were local to central Victoria, but they had gone up to where the fish kill was, and they did some beautiful interviews with the Indigenous people and local farmers and other people who've been affected by the amount of water that's extracted far north in Queensland. So the Murray-Darling Basin is massive. It's pretty much the entire southeastern region of Australia. All of the rivers run into the same network, and you guys are part of it.
Yeah, we're 30 k's from, or 35 k's from Wentworth, where it's the junction of the Murray and the Darling. So where we're sitting would have been pre-locks and weirs and barrage. It's just a huge delta. I think, just as an aside, I went up river with a heap of hydrologists and fish scientists in 2017 before the ABC pumped episode, and we stood at the weir in Wentworth, and Richard Minturn, who was at our water forum the other day, said on an average day over the Wentworth weir it's about 8,000 megalitres, but in 2016-17 flood it was 110,000 a day. But in 1956, the largest flood, once the river was regulated, was 360,000 megalitres a day. So the ephemerality and the variability of the system is absolutely phenomenal. So my grandfather had a mail run up to Menindee, and whenever there'd be a little cyclone drop into central southern Queensland and dissipate, all the old graziers, and the people who love fishing or yabbies would go, we'll get up the Frenchmans and the Anna Branch in 6 to 7 weeks, because that would be the time that it'd come down. So it was more regular to be in flood than not, It hardly ever dried. So there was like a clock, we've had the storm, we'll wait for the yabbies in 6 or 7 weeks. So there's a real, and that's reflecting on my story, but that would have been reflected on the Indigenous story for millennia.
What Jason was just saying then about that water coming down, you have those storms in Queensland and you expect that water to come down. That simply hasn't been happening.
Because of how much is being extracted up there by industrial farming methods.
Yeah, basically. So there's a lot of contention and people saying, well, it's always been like that. Those particular river systems up there have always gone through periods of dry and wet, but the evidence simply doesn't support that argument. It has never been this dry, and it has never occurred that there's been so much rain in Queensland and yet we still get so little water coming down that particular waterway. Look, we're actually pretty lucky here on the Murray because our water comes from the Snowy River, comes from that area up there.
So from the mountains on the
mountain
eastern
fed
coast.
rather than floodplain fed. Yeah.
So, of course, the connection that Jason was talking about is a little bit further sort of west of us. So the water that flows past us is coming from that mountainous region. But that water comes with its own difficulties because it's so controlled. So since the Hume Dam has been built up there, the water that comes down here is incredibly controlled. So the flood and dry patterns that this area is adapted to just don't happen anymore. So our wetlands are not getting the water that they need. We simply will not ever get the amount of water, even under normal flood conditions, those wetlands will never get the amount of water that they need, which is why we need to do things which the Mallee CMA is doing at the moment with the Victorian Floodplain Restoration Program, where they're putting infrastructure in so that they can actually get water to those wetlands, maintain the diversity, maintain those ecosystems, because there's no way that water is ever going to be able to come down and do that naturally anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me because obviously you are just one local council sitting on a river, but there's so many different councils and interest groups, and you mentioned the CMA, so that's the Catchment Management Authority, and there's different catchment management authorities all over the place, and they're government run, but they still have to negotiate with each other and with the government to try and figure out regulations. And one of the interesting things about that film that I mentioned earlier, When the River Runs Dry, it's called, the people talking about it said, I'm a lawyer, I've looked into this, and it's my job to understand all of the different factors playing into all of the different interest groups and everything. And it's still really hard to get your head around who's got control of what.
Well, if you want an interesting take on it, Richard Beasley QC has just written a book called Dead in the Water. He was the second QC below Brett Walker in the South Australian Royal Commission into the Murray-Darling Basin. And his suggestion is basically the Water Act in 2007 created a scientific document with the best available science that suggested that you needed between 4,600 and 7,900 gigalitres of water back to the environment for a healthy river, and then it was absolutely torn apart by the politics of the country. So a little bit of paralleling between climate change and hydrodenialism, as he calls it, where you begin to look at the science and wonder why we're so averse to actually taking science on board for what it is. So I recommend Dead in the Water. He's very blunt, he's very funny, he's a little bit cheeky, but if you wanted to read a book about a pure disengagement with scientific evidence, that would be the one you'd want to pick
where the
up.
politics completely overrides the evidence.
Well, I think if you look back at the trading system that Rudd put in and then we got rid of by the pressure of the carbon traded system, that's another example of how easily our politics can overturn actual science. And I think it's an interesting story. I'm getting a bit sociological
That's
or
okay.
meta on you.
That's good.
Is that, I think we're almost we are at a really interesting point where we can embrace and we can take on board what the science says and adhere to it and tell our politicians, Jodi and I included, that this is just not good enough. You don't need a lot of water to get an overbank flow to trigger that amazing engagement of the floodplains and all the nutrients coming back in and the healthy river. So it can be a working river, but it also needs flow. If you don't have flow, the cod and perch that represent in the South Australian Murray and the New South and Vic Murray come from the Darling because it's unregulated water when it comes down. So they still breed. There's still been great breeding opportunities in the last 6 years for cod and perch on that minimal amount of water, and then they go up and down the Murray at a rate of knots. Have you heard of the lamprey?
No.
The lamprey is... Sorry, I'm on my pet topic now. So the lamprey is this funny little long eel-looking fish that lives out in the Southern Ocean but breeds and has its fishlings.
Yeah.
Eelings?
Eelings.
Oh, fingerlings.
Fingerlings, there you go.
Are they fingerlings?
I believe
And
they
so
are.
they come from the Southern Ocean all the way to Yarrawonga and breed. But when all the locks and weirs put in, they stopped doing that. We've spent $13 billion on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and yet there's no water in the Darling. So, there's huge questions to be asked. They were asked in the South Australian Royal Commission, but why did the federal government not want to go? They didn't go. They said, we're not coming. They sent Mr.
They didn't
Walker.
go to the commission.
They refused to go, and they were going to take the Royal Commission to court to prove that they didn't want to present. So why would they do that?
I don't understand the legalities of a Royal Commission, but I think the point of them, isn't it, is to hold everyone accountable.
So they challenge the point of the legality of the nation. That's what I'm saying. So, there's a lot going on, a lot more could go on, but read Dead in the Water. It's interesting.
But it's also like, I just to get political here, and I understand that you hold office and you may not be able to comment, but the anti-corruption watchdog and the need for that at a federal level, I think these stories over and over and over again in so many different ways, from fracking gas and keeping coal fire alive and all of this water stuff, all points to the same thing, which is who has financial interest in making these systems stay.
So one more little political thing. Are you familiar with the disallowance of the 70 gigalitres in 2018? So in the structures of the basin plan, there was 70 gigalitres that was meant to go to the environment in the Northern Connected Basin. So lobbyists lobbied the government and they voted to take it away from the environment and give it back to agriculture and horticulture. That was at the start of 18. That 70 gigalitres, it mightn't have stopped the fish kills, but any amount of water would have been better than what it didn't come through. So it's not just one incident of a disconnect, it's many incidents. So you're right.
And look, just recently we had Keith Pitt came up here. He is the Federal Water Minister, and he and Anne Webster did a tour around and showed him what's going on in this region, so it was great to have him. But as he left, he said that he was withdrawing the on-farm water-saving mechanisms and that all water-saving mechanisms would now be done off-farm and that there would be no water buybacks to return water to the environment. So that's why these sort of political decisions are why it's so important to start thinking about how we're going to get water to the environment in another way, hence the infrastructure programs that we have happening on the Victorian side of the border with getting water into those very important ecosystems there. But they also save water for farming as well. So look, as we've been talking about, farming is going to be affected by climate change. They are going to be less rain events, then are going to be taking more water out of the river, so they do need to have enough water for us to be able to be a food and fibre producer. So we have to be innovative about how we are getting water to the environments that need it and water to those farmers as well. The complexity of it is enormous. The politics, the climate change, water trading. We haven't even touched on water trading. So but there are some really awesome people out there making some really great headway in finding that balance. The balance is there. We've just got to find it.
So when you were saying water saving on farms, that prevents farmers hoarding water, which is probably good, but it also means that they're going to draw from the river more.
No, I'm not necessarily talking about floodplain harvesting when I'm talking about water saving. I'm talking about things that farmers can do on their own farm that will reduce the amount of water that they have to draw from the river. So
they become more efficient.
So they're literally efficiency programs.
So they're preventing efficiency programs. Is that what you're saying?
What they're saying was that the water efficiency programs didn't produce the amount of environmental outcomes that they thought they would. So all the monitoring and measuring and evaluation that they've done haven't produced the amount of water back to the environment that they thought. It was actually negligible in the end.
There's an interesting overlay of that the Water Act is a scientific document. Richard Beasley says he's amazed that it actually got voted through because it's the most scientific document Australian government's ever passed. But from then on, in our region alone, there's probably been another 11,000 hectares of permanent plantings done. So there's all these other things going on in the background, and with the diminishing intakes, it looks like a perfect storm, remembering that we had the millennial drought, which most people reckon started in 1997. So we had nearly 13 years of very low intakes. Now, imagine when the next drought comes, it's not if, and we've got all those extra permanent plantings and we've got lower intakes into the system, and then we've got more people vying for the water. What does the price of water look like? I think it's about $6,000 a megalitre to buy for permanent. It's probably $450 to buy temporary.
And who do you buy that from? The government?
No, you can buy it from anyone. So
people have water rights?
Yeah. So,
and then that's water trading, is when you buy water off someone else.
Prior to when I grew up in a market garden over in Golgol on the other side of the river, and Dad's land and water were attached. So he had 15 acres and 80 megs. It wasn't a tradable thing. And then there was a desire to get more efficiency. So the water wanted to go to the highest return use. So that's why almonds and cotton are coming in. And then they've separated land and water and commodified water, remembering there was probably 30% of water that was never used because it had a value to the environment, but then it became a commodified value. So on top of the diminishing intakes, on top of the hyper growth that we've had the commodification of water that's made every drop worth something, and everybody's scrambled for that. So we're kind of sailing towards a perfect storm, in the Murray as well. Only if we have a really dry period, if we have La Niñas.
Which we will, obviously.
Of course,
yeah.
I think, and that's the interesting thing too. If you look at some of the data from the hydrologists, the river had a heartbeat. All that would change would be the volume. So it might be 7 GL this year and 14 next year and 12 next year and then 2. But it always flowed. I think one of the other bits of data. Sorry for going on about water. If our CEO was here, she'd just giggle. He's talking about water again. I toured the barrages the other day, which was absolutely phenomenal.
So what's a barrage?
The barrage is just like a lock, like a heap of doors that separate the saline water of the Coorong with the mouth of the Murray. So there's 530 of them. So prior to locks and weirs and barrages, on average, annually, there used to be 16,000 gigalitres of water would go out of the mouth of the Murray a year, on average. So it'd go higher, maybe 40, go lower, drought year, maybe 6. In the last 10 years, since some of the decisions that have been made around the environment, there's only 650 gigalitres go through the barrages. So the river doesn't flow. Now, the way to have a healthy river and
So what is that in terms, is that half or...
it's like
quarter, or I wasn't paying attention to the numbers.
16,000 to 650. Was that 1%?
It's a fraction.
It's a fraction of.
So 1%. That is amazing.
And that's that true politicisation, because you can come to certain parts of the basin and they'll blame the barrages for no one else getting any water. But if you say, well, let's take out the barrages and the locks and the weirs, and you can only pump when the natural system lets you. Not that I'm advocating that, because it has been a successful working.
Then you can't control the flow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can have a version that will keep the river healthy, and in a climate change real world, it shouldn't be a cap on water. It should be a cap on what are you growing and how you're growing it.
Why are we growing cotton here? Yeah. Why are we growing rice in Australia?
Well, I'm sure the Indigenous people said, why are you growing those funny red and green things that you make wine out of? Why are you growing them? So just to put a bit of a deeper narrative on it, why aren't we growing, acacias? Or I think you can make avgas out of the Mallee plant, or oils anyway.
We don't tell farmers what they can put in the ground here. We don't tell farmers what they can make money out of. And we don't tell farmers that they have to plant certain crops, because we allow the market to decide what makes money and what they can grow.
And we also allow international corporations to have massive amounts of land and grow things without regulation.
The way the water market is working, and as Jason described, it actually favours those massive mega agricultural farmers, because to them the water price is affordable. And if you
it's the cost of business.
It's the cost of business. So that when you go down to your local farmer who's been farming his land for generations, he struggles to buy water to continue farming.
For Mildura, into the future, if you're going to be greening your streets and needing to water those trees and keeping your local agribusinesses alive, what do you need to do as a council? Do you advocate at a political level? What's your power here?
Yeah, advocacy is the thing for the council here, and also joining together with other local councils that have similar issues.
The Murray River Group of Councils, which advocate together on energy transition, water, tourism, and digital connectivity. So that could cross the board to anything, but we, as in that group, only picks 4 things, so we can be committed to those 4 things, because sometimes when there's too many topics on the table, you can get lost.
And is that both sides of the border?
No, they have
That's all Victoria.
All Victoria, and then the equivalent is Ramjo's on the New South Wales side. It's about information, good information, the trust in science, and really trying to have a bit of a picture of where we might end up or where we might be. We're actually currently building our council plan, but also doing Vision 2040. So we're sort of encouraging people to say, well, what will it look like after another 19 years of climate change or expansion? They're really big questions, though, because culturally we are a coloniser nation. We do want to grow. We want to do more. But if there's an outer limit of what you can do, that's when the big questions have to come in. How do we do it? How do we maintain it?
Well, when we're talking about things like greening Mildura and planting trees, it's those initial stages where demands on resources, cash and water in this particular instance is going to be at its greatest. So in those initial stages, yes.
First couple of years,
it's intensive. They require a lot of water. But when those trees are established, then that sort of intensive amount of input they have to put into them will start to drop off a little bit. They'll start to maintain themselves. So, yeah, look, it can look intensive in the beginning, but the payback that you get from investing in something like that now is going to be massive in the future.
So, but I think they really work together. This transition for me is that, we've over focused on the water and trying to get as much out of it as we can. So there needs to be a step away and a recalibration, and we've underutilised the sun. I'm making a metaphoric statement. This, it's not that difficult. It shouldn't be that difficult to change what we do and how we do it, particularly with the great amount of information we have around us. Our council has hit higher than it has should over and over again, because we've had good councillors, we've had great staff and good leadership to say, what's it actually like to live on the edge of the desert? When you can have -3 in June and 47 in January. It's Don Watson's book, The Bush, talks about the Mildura, and he says even Indigenous Australians didn't really live or do anything out there. They'd go through it and they could survive off it, but it wasn't something where they would put a permanent camp near a billabong or near the river or a lake.
Did you come up with that great quote the other day that somebody said, nobody really knows who created the Mallee, but the devil is strongly suspected?
Our state member, Ali Cupper, said that the other day.
That was great. Yeah, thanks, Ali.
So, and once again, this ties into maybe why it's difficult to take on the new attitudes or aspects, is we are very resilient. Mildura was an irrigation colony that failed within the first 5 years, that was promised so much by the state government and got nothing. There's always the concept of the Bendigo line, 100 k's north of Bendigo on an arc. Nothing ever comes further than that. That's changing now because we're becoming very vocal and we're saying, well, how do we fit into the Federation? How the hell do we fit into the state, for a start? What's that other one? Garrett Glaris Barachiklian rang up Dan Andrews and said, Dan, is Mildura in Victoria? He said, no, ring Steve Marshall. I think it's in South Australia. So there's all these...
Really?
No, this is a joke. Oh. It's a total joke. So...
that's how misinformation gets out there.
No, but I'm talking about that because, like anywhere in rural Australia, the hub and spoke method of how Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane worked well still has deficiencies within that.
So you mentioned the Indigenous people, and I'm always interested in this interplay with the Australian environment and how we want to grow whatever we want to grow regardless of actually what the environment is. So can you tell me a little bit about who the local Indigenous group are?
Yep. So we've just, in the last little while, there's the people of the Mildura Mallee. So on the New South Wales side, it's the Barkinji, it's the Latchi Latchi, the Neri Neri and the Warragai. So there's a few. We have a really good reconciliation action plan. When I grew up in Golgol in the early 70s, there was still Aboriginal people living on the river in unpowered sites. I'm 51. And I find it quite emotive to talk about because there is a genuine lack of understanding that we've been here for 238 years and Indigenous Australians have been here for 2,600 generations, if not more. So the Indigenous community in Mildura works really hard to be involved and to have a say. We try and foster that as much as we can, but they have difficulties within their own communities as well. And it's getting better, but there's always more work that could be done to engage the Indigenous community. And I can't imagine, it's tough just to live here as someone who's got all the best opportunities other than the disadvantage that Indigenous Australians continually come up against.
Yeah, look, there's different points of view in the Indigenous community. It's the same as there is in any community. When it comes to consultation about water and about what happens with water, it's very heavily skewed towards irrigators. Despite the fact that the 2007 Water Act and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is designed to deliver water to the environment, politics and power intersect with that, and we get the complex outcomes that we have. Now, Indigenous people simply, I'm not going to speak for them, I recommend that you find somebody, but look, they're a minority, and the things that they want to use the water for might not necessarily gel with what the majority of people want to use that water for. And in the end, despite the fact that there's a consultation that goes on, I'm afraid that sometimes their voices get lost.
And when you think about the fact that we just came in here and took it all and then set up these systems, it seems so outrageous.
Nobody understands how these river systems would run better than the people that have lived next to them for 40,000 years.
And then overlaid all the engineering works that we've done on those rivers to make them working rivers. Richard Beasley talks about, the Indigenous Australians, they were about sharing. You didn't take too much. You didn't show off or steal or what have you, and you made sure that the people upstream did the right thing and the people downstream did the right thing. In the middle, you got your little bit as well.
Aboriginal people are absolutely capable of their own engineering feats.
The Barwarana fish chips.
One of the oldest engineering feats known on the planet.
Yeah.
Aboriginal people did it first, but they did it in a way that was sustainable. They did it in a way that they weren't taking too much and that they allowed everything that was in that river to have its place and to have its time, and they did it in concert with the natural rhythms of that place. We could learn a few things.
Yeah, we sure could.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the big things for me is when the Uluru Statement from the Heart was put to the federal government. Yeah, it was just ignored, and it had taken 5 years to put together, and it was a document that got all Indigenous people involved and on board. And all Indigenous Australians have been asking for since colonisation is to have a voice, not in and of the chamber, but to the chamber, which there is a clear difference, because that was the scare tactic used. Oh, you can't have another chamber in the House. No, it's just a voice. ATSIC seemed to work pretty well from the 90s and until it was disbanded. So how do we as a local government, I think we're doing a reasonable job, engage with the Indigenous peoples, but that overall understanding of that longest connection with the land, of the nature of the dream time, and what we take from Indigenous people that we continually overlook. Indigenous humour, they say, resonates through Australian society like you've never seen, but we take it as our own. So there's other little things that if we embraced indigeneity for what it was and understood their deeper resilience and ability to survive, we may well make better decisions.
Absolutely. Thanks. So before we go, I just wanted a little bit of background from you both. Like, what brought you here? How did you, Tyler, become the mayor?
Look, I was born and bred in Golgol, Italian father, Anglo mum. Grew up in the 70s when I copped a little bit of grief, but not much, and was just always interested. As I said, I used to go to the church in St Michael's in Boronga, and we'd come out and look over a floodplain after praying to God, and there was this ineffable feeling out there in the bush that no one ever really wanted to talk about, but it was clearly there. Could have gone on in school, but just couldn't concentrate in a classroom, and then went off and did a trade, and then travelled, did a heap of travel all over the country and internationally, and then came back here and started, talking a bit too much and having too many opinions, and people would say, well, just do something about it. So my wife has a really big giggle. I was going to run in the 2012 council election, and I kept on saying, oh yeah, I'll go and sign up tomorrow. And she said, it's going to close, because she knows that sometimes I don't get to what I said I'm going to do. Oh, yeah, I'll sign up tomorrow. And she said, it's going to close tomorrow. I said, look, I'll go in at 1 o'clock and sign up. So I went in at 1 o'clock and the doors closed at 12. So I missed the application. So then I ran the next time, got in, became deputy mayor. But yeah, just have a real deep concern for the region, want to have a better understanding of how we make it sustainable.
You came in with sustainability in mind and the environment, and that was a large part of
water
what
and power.
Yeah.
Yep. It was pretty much, and transparency, all that sort of stuff as well. But yeah, it's and I'm really lucky to be doing it in not my hometown, because I've lived over the river until I was 23 and then travelled and then bought here 20 years ago. It's just really nice to know that this is a great place and there's a lot going on and we have good people around us. But there's work to do, whether it's around engagement with the Indigenous population, energy transition or water, my three favourite ones. There's other stuff like that, but some of the work's being done. How do we do the rest of it and be considerate about that?
And what about you, Jodi?
Well, I guess it's been a bit of a lifelong passion of the environment, watching it change, seeing how it's affected by human activity, just a lifelong interest and passion for me, the environment. Moving to Mildura 7 years ago brought home to me in graphic colour how the river is being decimated and what an impact people and society has had on that. So I grew up in South Australia, moved away and became a geologist, and moved here to work with a mining company called Crystal Mining, and actually quite happy to work with a sand mining company because sand miners have some of the best rehabilitation methods and success of any other mining company. So not too bad of a mining company to work for if you're going to have a love for the environment. But look, the issues that are apparent here, I'd never been aware of them before, and I think that if you don't live on the banks of these rivers, you take your water for granted. If you turn on a tap and the water's coming out of it, you just expect that to happen. You think of that as your right for that to happen, and in some ways it is. But I think that we can expect that that's going to happen less and less. We've already had situations in towns in Tamworth and in Dubbo and in other places where they've had to truck water into those places because they're natural sources of water.
Pooncarie and Menindee even closer.
Pooncarie and Menindee closer to home, where their natural sources of water simply aren't available to them anymore. And that's as a direct result of overuse, over allocation and climate change. So we really have to, as much as possible, bring these issues to a wider audience, to all those people out there in the capital cities turning on their taps and watching the water come out. You need to know this is a resource that's in danger. So that's, this is something that sort of came to really in my discussions with Jason, I think, because he was passionate about water, and we met through our kids who went to school together. So I met Jason's partner, and of course the political discussions ensued.
Yes. Late into the night.
Very quickly after that. I come from a political sort of family, so my brother actually ran against Barnaby Joyce in his seat going back a couple of elections ago, David Ewing's. So yeah, a bit of a political background, and once again it's a bit of a case of, well, do something, if you're going to have
Stop gas bagging.
Well, you never stop gas bagging. You just gas bag somewhere else.
This is true.
Sorry.
Yeah. But look, I got in on a gender equity kind of basis. There was a big push for more women in local council. So the women that put up their hands this time to run through, fabulous women, really, really great range from women with a strong desire to make positive change in the region. Didn't get everybody up, unfortunately, but really proud of the women that did get in.
But there was a conscious effort of women to say, hey, we need more women, we should all run.
Absolutely, and we all supported each other all through that. So there was some ups and downs for a couple of the women candidates, but no,
it's never going to be easy, is it?
It's never going to be easy for a female candidate. So look, the women that did get in, that's fantastic, and they're making a big impact already, which is good to see. But the other thing was accountability and transparency. There was a feeling in the electorate that perhaps council wasn't necessarily listening or taking a lot of notice of what the public feeling was. And I think that there has been a really good conscious effort on behalf of council to understand that and to change that. And I think the other thing is there was some situations in council where I thought that as far as I'm going to be out there, the conduct of some of the councillors, I didn't think. So it's the reputation of council. We have to have the highest level of integrity in our council so that people will look to the council and say, we are proud to have those people in that council representing us. And I looked at the council at that time and I couldn't see that. And I wanted to make sure that if I got in, that I would be that person that I would hope to see representing me in council.
That's great. Thanks. That's cool. Is there anything else you guys want to say about Mildura or the region or sustainability or climate change?
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about community groups and the grassroots community groups that we've got here. So we've just recently added to policy on the environment some words about plastics and tackling single-use plastics in the region. And at the grassroots level, we've got a group of people and they've just got a grant to work together to make that happen from the grassroots level. So we've got multiple levels of change happening in this region. So it's great that council is reflecting that and that we're here to facilitate those grassroots movements that want to make change here. So yeah, really pleased to see that.
If just for me, I think it's an indication of how things can change, and when you're politically aware, you can, whether gently at the start and then with an avalanche later, actually through your voting habits and how you take on your information, actually change what's going on around you. And I think our community's absolutely primed to just have that second glance and see what's going on.
That's great. I really like that. That's great. All right, thanks, guys. I think that'll do.
Thanks, Alison. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
We don't like talking.
I can tell. I really had to drag it out of you. That was the Mayor of Mildura Rural City Council, Jason Modica, and Councillor for the Environment and Sustainability, Jodi Reynolds. Links to many of the things discussed, including the previous episodes related to this episode, can be found in the show notes on the podcast and at saltgrasspodcast.com. The next few episodes are also going to be from up in the same region. I'll share a chat I had recently with two people from the Aboriginal Corporation, the first people of the Mildura Mallee, and also we'll take a tour of the local community garden recorded back in March, so stay tuned for those interviews. For those of you listening on Main FM and 3MDR, please note that you can listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your preferred podcasting app. If you can't find Saltgrass on your podcasting app, please let me know and we'll see what we can do to make it available there. You can contact us through the website at saltgrasspodcast.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and please subscribe to our email list to get reminders and updates about the show. This program was made possible with support from Main FM and the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. My name is Ali Hanley. Thanks for listening.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.